So today's daf is Chav Hey, but we still have a piece to finish up on Chav Dalid Amud Beis. Amal Charav, it's about 20 lines up from the bottom. And you'll see a Tosas Omar Rebbe. And if you drop down about 5-6 lines in that Tosas straight across, see the word Mafkinon, and we're up to Omar Lecha Rav. Now, let's just understand that Rav had said that in a case where there was a call about a woman having an extramarital relationship with a man, Rav said that call, some sort of a rumor, is not sufficient to force a divorce if this person about whom she had this, supposedly had this relationship, would marry her, unless 2 witnesses came by and testified that they actually saw the immorality. Then and only then do we bust up the marriage if she marries the Boel. And Rav Sheshes had pointed out that Rav may have been half asleep when he gave that ruling because it's contradicted by a brisa. And I think we'll actually go through this brisa again in order to appreciate Amal Charav. Amal Charav, where we want to start where we left off yesterday, is really an answer to reinterpret the brisa and defend Rav against the onslaught of Rav Sheshes. So Rav Sheshes quotes a brisa, and the brisa says the Sanya, which is about 5 lines earlier, 1 line above Tosfos Omar Rebbe. Hanitan al eshes ish votziuha al yado v'nisgarsha mitachas yidei acher im kanas lo yotzi. So the Bryce is talking about a case where, again, we have a suspicion of an immoral relationship, and the husband divorces his wife, who is suspected of that relationship, and after the divorce, she gets remarried to someone else, and then she gets divorced from the second husband. And the suspected Boel now was not allowed to marry her, but if he went ahead, he married her, the Brisa says lo yotzi. And Rav Sheshes analyzes the case. He says, if 2 witnesses testify about the znus, then how could you say lo yotzi? Ki asa acher v'afseke lekola mai havi, even though she got married to someone else, and now the rumor quieted down, but nevertheless, we have 2 witnesses that this is the Boel. He's not allowed to live with her. He can't resume the marriage. We have to break that up. And that's based on the parsha of V'nitma shtei pa'amim echel lebal echel leboel el alav deleka edim. There were no witnesses. And now, in the absence of witnesses, the question is, do we bust up the marriage between the so-called Boel and her? And the answer is, the Brisa seems to indicate that it all depends upon whether in the meantime, in the middle of this, she married someone else. And that's going to be a hefsek on the kol. That's going to quiet down the rumor. So time of the reason why we're not going to break up this marriage is the asa acher v'afseke lekola, because she got married in between. And that quiets down the kol. Halav hachi, if not for those very unique circumstances, had the Boel immediately, without her marrying someone else, but after the divorce that was given to her by her husband, if he would now marry her, then mafkina, we're going to break up their marriage. So we see that even in the absence of Edim, because again, if there were Edim, then it certainly has nothing to do with hefsek kol. But the reason why lo yotzi, we don't bust up the marriage, is because of this hefsek kol. But in the absence of the hefsek kol, even though there are no Edim, apparently we would be breaking up the marriage, and that's against Rav Rav says there's no proof from the Brisa. And the truth is, says the Brisa, that there's a kol, and according to Rav Shita, based on a kol, we would not break up the marriage, and therefore, hu adin the afagav the lo even without a hefsek kol, meaning even if she hadn't gotten remarried and divorced following the divorce that was given to her by her husband, nevertheless, we would still allow the marriage to continue if there are no Eidim. And that's Rav Shita. Now you have to ask yourself, so why did this Brisa make it contingent on the fact that she got married to someone else in Afsaka Kola? So the Gemara says, Hachi Kamar. It doesn't mean that Afsaka Kola in this Brisa is a Kula, but rather it's a Chumrah. The Brisa wants to tell you that even though there was Afsaka Kola, meaning she got married in between, we're not going to allow her to get married. What I mean is we're not going to allow her to get married to the so-called Boel, to the suspected Boel. So the din is that if she married this guy, the suspected Boel, we're not going to break up the marriage. And that's true even if she hadn't got married in between to another person and quieted down the coal. But l'chatchila, we're not going to allow such a marriage. So again, just to summarize, and this is where we left off yesterday, according to Rav Shita, we will not break up the marriage of the Boel to this woman in the absence of Eidim. Only if there are Eidim, and then there's no choice, because then there's an Isar Vechel L'Baal Echel L'Bo, but in the absence of Eidim, based on a kol, we will not break up the marriage. Beisvei, now the Gemara asks another kash on Rav, when do we say that even if he marries her, meaning the Nitan is the so-called suspected Boel, marries her, that we're going to force a divorce, what was her situation with the original husband? Did she have children or not? And the Brisa says that whether or not we'll break up the marriage between the Nitan and her depends upon whether she had children from the first marriage. If she had children from the first marriage, lo teitze, we will not break up the marriage with the so-called Nitan, because it might create a situation of Laz al Baneh. If we break up that marriage, it really strengthens the impression in the public that she had this immoral action with him, and there may be the children from her first marriage are not really her children, and that's going to create a Laz of Mamzeris. In Bo Eidei Tuma, now there are two Eidim that testify that she had znus. Afilu yesh la kama banim teitze. I don't care how many children she had for her original husband. We have now absolute reliable testimony on the fact that she had znus, and echel l'baal, echel l'baal, we have to break up the marriage. This is against Rav, because Rav says that only if there are Eidim, Eidei Tuma, will we break up the marriage. But here it sees clearly that in the case of Ein La Banim, we're going to break up the marriage, even though there are no Eidim. So Rav answers, Rav Mukile Masnisin, Yesh La Banim. The case of our Mishnah is a case where she has children from her original husband, and therefore, we can't break up the marriage because of the laws issue, but if there are witnesses that she had a Maisis Nus, then and only then will we break up the marriage. So the Gemara asks the following kasha: "My duchte de Rav, what forced Rav into this docha? That there are children to the first marriage, and then we'll only break up the marriage to the Nitan in event that she had children." And then yeshla edim. I'm sorry. So if she had children from the first marriage and there's only kol, then we won't break up the marriage from the nitan. But if on the other hand there are witnesses, then we'll break up the marriage. The time adika edim afkinon, ileka edim lo mafkinon. We're not going to break up the marriage if there were no edim in the absence of edim. All we have is kol. That's not enough. That's not sufficient ground to break up the marriage. Look, why couldn't Rav interpret that Mishnah be she'ein lo banim? She has no children from the first marriage. Af agav deleka edim. And then, Memele, we understand very well that there's only a kol and there are no edim. And then the Mishnah is telling me that since there are no edim, we'll break up the marriage. I'm sorry, since there are no children from the first marriage, despite the fact that there are no edim on this dus, we'll break up the marriage. Why couldn't Rav accept that? What forced Rav to the conclusion that kol alone is not enough to break up the marriage? And therefore, he's going to say that in the Mishnah, she had edim. Why not just say that in the Mishnah, we're talking about a case where she has no children, and we're going to break up the marriage based on the kol, even the absence of edim. Why is Rav allergic to that kind of interpretation? Because Rav had a question on the Mishnah. My area detani hotzi uha. Why is it that the Mishnah says hotzi uha, which means they forced the Baal, meaning the Nitan, against his will to give a divorce? Lisni hotzia. Why didn't the Mishnah say hotzia? Which means that even in a case where hotzio sami daito on his own initiative, the Mishnah would still insist that lo yichnos oso lechatchila, that he should not, meaning the Nitan should not marry her. Hello, we're going to have to say hotziua means Bezdin forced him. Kol hotziua be horas Bezdin. Bezdin? Now Rav says, why would Bezdin break up this marriage? And it has to be be'edim hu demafki, because kol itself would not be enough to break up a marriage. And therefore Rav had to interpret that Mishnah as talking about a case where there were edim, and therefore you're going to have to say yesh la banim, because if not, then even with kol would be enough to create a din of teitzei. Ibai Simon Gemara offers an alternative interpretation of Rav, and that is that according to the Tanav Mishnah, we would not break up the marriage with the nitan based on a kol, even in a case of Eila Banim. She doesn't have children for the first marriage. Vahani Masnisa, Rebbe is of the opinion that we break up a marriage based on kol. The Sanya we learned in the Brisa. Now, this Brisa is like reading a soap opera. All sorts of situations that, we say where there's smoke, there's fire. You're familiar with that phrase? So, for example, Rochel. Rochel is like Avon calling. You remember that? He goes from house to house and he sells perfumes and jewelry and so forth. So these guys, they went around during the morning hours and the husbands weren't around, and there were all sorts of suspicions about what they were doing over there. And Rochel Yotze, the husband in this case, found the Rochel leaving the house. The Isha and his wife is Chogeres Besinar. She's putting back her girdle, that covers her privates. Like, what's going on over here? She wasn't wearing a girdle and she's putting it back on, and he's walking out of the house like. Amar Rebbe Holu Mechubar Adam. Mechubar Adam means literally it's repulsive, it's disgusting. It means there's some immorality going on. Teitze, then we have to break up the marriage. Another example, Rokla Malam and Akila. Right, there was a kila is a it's called in English, I forget what it's called. You know, those canopy beds, you know what I'm talking about? And you know, he sees, I'm not sure if rok is to be taken literally here, or maybe he sees you know, something indicating that there was a sexual relationship here. And Omer Rebbe Hol Mechora Dover, since the circumstances indicate that there was znus, and you know, she was I don't know, I'm not sure exactly of all the circumstances. Apparently she was lying back, and I don't know, it says here in my translation of the Gemara, it says Rakaka Klape Gag Hakila is Teitze. Again, some circumstantial evidence. Now we turn to the daf for today, that's Chafei. Minolim Hafuchim. There's some strange man's shoes at the foot of her bed. And Hafuchim, and they're turned on the other side, which means PM Lamata Vishulel Lamala. It's like it's upside down, apparently trying to, you know, give us a false impression, as if as if he was not there, or it's just a lost pair of shoes or something. And Tachas Amita, he finds it under her bed. I'm a Rebbe Hol Mechuvar Dover Teitze. So we're going to break up the marriage. He says here, Nikar mitocha inyan shezinsa im adam acher. She left enough circumstantial evidence to indicate that she was having this immoral relationship. And that person, hafaches min olav, he turned his shoes upside down, kidesh lo yuchal lahakris miyam. They wouldn't be able to identify the owner of the shoes. Then we have another case. Oh, no, now the Gemara is going to ask. Min olim afuchim lichse deman ninhu. Why don't we try to identify the owner of these shoes? We'll turn them back from inside out to upside down and everything else. And that's going to prove who she had this relationship with. And he says, Im yisbar lahem, if he'll clarify, for example, that these shoes belong to the Rochel that he just saw running out of the house, then advar mochichim shezinsa imo, it looks very convincing evidence, circumstantial evidence that she had znus with him. But you know what? If it doesn't belong to the Rochel, then maybe somebody left his shoes there and asked her to watch his shoes. Ella, the Gemara says, we're not talking about a case where the shoes themselves were upside down, but makom min olim hafuchim. The karka, the ground underneath the bed, was, I guess, somehow it was upside down. He says here, Medubar shemotzu asam min olim atzma hafuchim. Lo medubar, sorry. Ela nimtza b'makom b'karka shel etzad hamita. Again, it was sort of facing the bed, and that's a siman shel min olim hafuchim, and that indicates that a man came to have znus with her, and he turned the shoes the other way around. They shouldn't recognize him. They shouldn't identify him. In any event, let's get back to the brisa on Daf Chav Daled Amud Beis. There are two brises that seem to be indicative of the fact that we'll break up the marriage to the Nitan, to the Boel, even in the absence of Aden. So the Gemara is offering that those brises should be attributed to the sheet of Rebbe, who holds that even if you only have a davar mechur without any witnesses, if there's a strong reason to believe, and so for in our case here, if there's a call, is then we're going to break up the marriage. Okay? So therefore, we don't have after kasha on Rav. Hilchas hakavasi de Rav. However, the Gemara finally accepts the sheet of Rav Halacha. We're not going to break up a marriage with the Boel or with the Baal unless we have two witnesses. Hilchas hakavasi de Rebbe. Now, here we have a contradiction. We just finished saying that according to Rebbe, all we need is circumstantial evidence like a kohl, and we'll break up the marriage. So kasha hilchasa hilchasa. Rav was the one who said that you must have Eidim. Lo kasha. In one case, it's bekola de posuk, meaning after this rumor went out, she went ahead and got married. She was divorced by her husband, then she got married to someone else. That's called a hefsek kol. And that quiets down the rumor. Bekola de lo posuk. Another psak halacha is that we're talking about a case where the kol continues. And the Gemara explains that. Kol de lo pasik, vileka edim, kirabi. If the kol continues, even in the absence of edim, we're going to pass like Rebbe, and based on kol, we're going to create an iser, we're going to break up the marriage. But kol of the pasuk, if on the other hand the kol stops, then we're not going to aser her based on kol and break up the marriage, but only in ika edim, only if there are witnesses to testify in this news. Kirav, and then Allah is like Rav. So Gemara asks for kol de lo pasuk ad kama. How long does the kol continue until you establish it and categorize it as lo pasuk? Amar Abai, Amrli Aim, right? Abai was raised by not his biological mother, but his adoptive mother. And Dumi de Masa. What is Dumi de Masa? Yoma de Upalga, a day and a half. And that's called Chashude Ha'ir. I'm not sure what Chashude Ha'ir means, but whatever they're suspected of, if the rumor persists for a day and a half, that's considered Delo Posik. Below Amar El Delo Posik Beni Ubeni. Now, Posik Beni Ubeni or Posik. Let's say within that day and a half, there was an hour or so when they denied this kol, and the word went out that the kol was just sheker v'chaz. So that's called posik. The law run on el de lo posik machmas yira. When do we say that since it's low posik, we're going to rely on this kol even to break up a marriage? That's only when the rumor was not based on yira. Aval posat, if it interrupts machmas yira, so then we assume machmas yira hu de posik, and that's not called posik. So yira, I think here in this context means that if you're continuing a rumor and you keep passing it on, then somebody might sue you for slander, or somebody might knock your block off. So that's called yira. So you shut your mouth because you're afraid. It's like a witness protection system. Lo Amran, and when do we say that we rely on the kol? El doleka oivim. Aval ika oivim hu diafkule kol. If there are enemies of the isha, of the woman, or maybe of the nitan, the suspected boil, then we think that these eidim might have deliberately and dishonestly created this rumor. They started this rumor. Tanana, so we learned to the Mishnah in Gittin on Daf Mem Hamid Beis. Hamotzi es ishto mishum shemra. A man hears a rumor that his wife is having another relation, extramarital, and he divorced his wife. Then lo yachs, if he changes his mind and he wants to remarry his wife after he gave her get, then we don't allow him to do so. We'll see why. Mishum neder. Alternatively, let's say she took upon herself a neder, and because that neder is so harsh, he decides to divorce his wife. Now she has a change of heart. He wants to remarry her. Lo yachsu, we won't allow him to remarry her. The Gemara there in Gittin gives two explanations. According to the Lishna Kama, it's because of Chayshina L'Kilkula. What does that mean? We're afraid that after he divorced her, she might marry someone else. And then when he finds out that the Shem Ra, the original Shem Ra, which motivated him to divorce his wife, is no longer alive and active, it's batel. Or for example, if she took a neder and then a chacham would be matir her neder, so the original husband now is going to come and he'll say, well, I only divorced her because of the Shem Ra. I only divorced her because of the neder. And I only known that the Shem Ra would be batel, or that a chacham would be matir the neder, I never would have divorced her. Which means that she was still his wife, and she has children from another wife. They're all mamzerim. And the other opinion in the Gemara says that the reason why they established that he's not allowed to remarry her is because they don't want Bnos Yisrael to be prutos v'arayos. The women have to understand the repercussions that if they have this kind of relationship, that'll break up their marriage, and it's irreversible. Shalach le Rabba bar Huna le Rabba bar Nachman. Bilamdeinu Rabbeinu. Okay, we're talking about a person who divorced his wife because of a Shem Ra, because of this rumor. Kanas Mao Sheyotzi. We said in the Mishnah in Gittin he's not allowed to remarry her, but what if he did? Do we recognize that marriage? Amalei Tnena. We learned in our Mishnah, and this is our Mishnah here in Masechet Yevamot, that Nitan al Eishes Ish Votzi Ua Mitachas Yadav Pisha Kanas Yotzi. That if there's a suspected rumor about a certain person that he had a relationship with an Eishes Ish, and now he marries her, Yotzi, we're going to break up that marriage. And therefore, we should apply that same reasoning to the case of Motzi Isha, Mishum Shem Ra, that since he gave her a get because he relied on the coal, on that rumor, and therefore, even if he marries her, which he wasn't allowed to do, then we're going to be machmer on him. We're going to force him to divorce his wife, just like we did in our Mishnah here. Amalei, so Rabbah responds and he says, no, you have no proof. There's no analogy. Meet dummy. Hassam, in the case of our Mishnah, of the Nitan Hotziuha, means Bezdin, as we said before, were Motzi Harmi Baila, against his will. Which means that there were Eidei Tuma Shazin, there were two witnesses. And since we have a Vadai, we now know that she had this extramarital relationship. Then the Torah says she's not allowed to remain married to her husband and can't marry the Boel. So that's why Imkanas Yotz. But Hacha, here in the case of Motzi Shem Ra, the language of the Mishnah is Hotzi'ah, which means on his own initiative. He wasn't obligated. Nobody compelled him to divorce his wife. He did it on his own. There were no witnesses. It was just a call. And therefore, it's quite possible that in this set of circumstances, that Imkanas Lo Yotz, we're not going to force a divorce. For Rabba bar Rav Nachman, he was the one who tried to use our Mishnah as a proof to answer the suffix of Rabba bar Rav Huna. In his gears in the Mishnah, it said Hotziyah, which means that it's not that the Baal is chayav to be Megarish's wife, but on his own initiative, he decided, Mirtzono Midaito, to give a get to his wife. and there were no Eidei Tumah. We're not going to force him to divorce his wife. There's only a call. And nevertheless, if he went ahead and he married her, Yotzi. And therefore, we should prove from that a Motzi Shemishum Shemra also, if he went ahead and he married her, remarried her, he has to give her a get. So the Gemara says, Vakati mi dami. The analogy is not accurate. Hacha, in the case in Masechet Gittin, we don't know if a person who is motzi is as ishto mishum shemra, and he's not allowed to marry her. What happens if he went ahead and he married her? Do we break up the marriage or not? It's bibal. We're talking about the husband of this woman. He was her husband all along. And therefore, if he remarries her, that's not such a terrible thing. But Hassam, in the Mishnah here, Yevamos, is Boel, not Baila, but Boel. Boel is the Nitan, who's suspected of having znus with her. It's a Dor Maguna. And therefore, the Chachamim were machayev that even if he marries her, he has to divorce. But you cannot derive from that anything about the original suffix of Rabbi Bar Huna in a case where the Baal himself went ahead and remarried this woman. Amalei, nevertheless, Shaper Domi Adadi, Rabbi defends his equation, his analogy. Hacha in the case of Nitan. Is Amra Bonalo Yichnos Vim Konas Yotzi Hachinami. So too, in the case of Motzi Ishto Mishum Shemra, Amri Rabbonalo Yachzir Vim Konas Yotzi. So it doesn't matter whether or not it was Bezdin that got involved and they told him not to marry her, or he on his own initiative went ahead and he married her. In both cases, we're going to break up the marriage. Gemara says below, the Gemara rejects this. Hassam, in the case of our mission of Nitan, and then he went ahead and he married her. Ilume al Melakola. By marrying her, that only strengthens the kol, indicating that he was the one who had that illegitimate relationship with her. And that's why he went ahead and he married her. So therefore, they were very machmir on him, and they said him konas yotzi. Otherwise, this rumor is going to get stronger and stronger. But Hacha, here in the case where on his own initiative, he divorced his wife, Yishum Shemra, and now he remarries her, Adrabah. On the contrary, the fact that he remarries his wife, Amrinon Kum Be Bekola Delesa. It indicates that he checked out the kol, the Baal checked out the kol, this rumor, he went back to its roots, and he discovered, like, Sherlock Holmes, that it's not reliable. So when he checks out and he investigates and he discovers that the kol is sheker, and then he remarries her, that's a whole different story. We're not going to derive from our Mishnah that here also, when he checked out the rumor and he found out that it's not true, and he married her, that we're going to break up that marriage. Okay, we're up to the Mishnah now, here on Daf Chaf Hey. At the beginning of Masechet Gittin, we have a halacha of a shliach who brings a get from Medinas Hayam, and now he has to testify b'fanei nechta. Now maybe get Medinas Hayam, so from a far off place he brings it to Eretz Yisrael. V'yomer, and the shliach declares in front of Bezdin, b'fanei nechta. So I know that the get is kosher. And based on his testimony, meaning the testimony of the shliach, we're going to allow her to get remarried, but lo yisa, the shliach himself should not marry a sishto. And this is a concept called lazus sfasayim, which means that we're worried about the rumors. People are going to suspect, well, he's bringing the get and he's marrying her. Like maybe this is not on the up and up. So therefore, we tell the shliach, listen, buddy, you can't marry her. Mace. Now we have a witness that testifies that this woman's husband died and she's allowed to get married. And once again, we're gonna say lo yisas ishto. We're not gonna allow him to marry her because he himself was the aide that was matir her. It looks very suspicious. Case number 2, haraktiv. I murdered her husband. Haragnu. Eid echad omer haragtiv im od anoshim. I was part of a mafia group. We knocked him off. He says, as far as this aid is concerned, lo yisa es ishto. The woman about whom he's testifying that her husband died, we're not going to allow him, the witness, to marry her. Now, it's interesting. Haraktiv means he admits and confesses the guilt of murder. And that's going to be the Gemara's next discussion. Rabbi Yehuda Omer haraktiv lo tinase ishta. If a man testifies that I killed so-and-so's husband, she's not allowed to get married. Not to him and not to anyone else. Haragnu, which means that I saw others put him to death, tinase ishta. Then we can rely on that testimony. She can get married. Now, I'm not sure. He adds here a word, lacher. Tinase ishto lacher. Let me just see how does he know that? Tinase. Yeah, Rashi says it. It's the last of the skinny lines. Rashi says li'acher. So Gemara says, "Time of Dinus Hayam." The reason why we're not going to allow him to marry her, this shliach is not allowed to marry her because he brought the get from Medina Sayyam, and he had to testify before and we rely on the shliach and his testimony in order to allow this woman, this formerly married woman, to get married. Is therefore he himself is not allowed to marry her because we're relying on his testimony as the shliach to be matir. The implication of the Mishnah is that if he had brought the get me Eretz Yisrael, where there's no requirement of we're not relying on the shliach. We're just looking at the shtar, at the get. Is then yisa es ishto. So what's the Gemara's problem? So the Gemara says, I'm sorry, mes. We have halach of isha daiku mitzvah. It's also Gemara here in Yevamot. It's much later on that when one witness testifies that her husband died, Bezdin will rely on the fact that this woman would not risk it and get married to someone else until she actually investigates and is absolutely certain 100% that her husband died. That's called Isha Daiku Mitzvah. So Lava Leika Samchina. We're not relying on the witness. the Omar Mar, but rather the reason why we rely on the witness is because he should daiku mitzvah. She goes out and she clarifies with absolute certainty that her husband in fact died. Uketani lo yisas ishto. And yet, even in the case of Mace Baila, we're not going to allow him to marry her. Why not? We're not relying on him. So it should be like the case of maybe get Eretz Yisrael. So Gemara answers, Hassam, in the case where he testifies on the death of her husband, Leka Ksava. It's not that we're totally relying on Daiku Mitzvah. And he's not holding on to any sort of document that testifies that her husband died. We're relying on him. And therefore we have a chash that he's testifying falsely in order to go ahead and marry this woman. But here in the case of maybe get the Eretz Yisrael, Ika Ksama, the get is in his hands. There's no chashash, there's no suspicion that maybe it's a counterfeit. There are two witnesses signed on it. And based on the get itself, we're going to allow her to get married. So maybe get Eretz Yisrael, where there's no requirement for any nechtav, and he's got a shtar, a get with two witnesses on it. Now we're not afraid of ziyuf, is therefore she can get remarried. Tisnan, we have a Mishnah later on in Daf Kuf Yud Zayin, and the Mishnah makes a fundamental distinction. When do we rely on the testimony of a woman? And the answer is that there are five categories of ladies, where we don't rely on their testimony of any of these five that this woman's husband died. And that's a halach of sinah, that there's a certain very strong enmity, jealousy, and tension between these five categories of women, chamoso, etc., etc., and therefore we're afraid that they're testifying false. But nevertheless, these same five women are believed to bring a get from Medinas Hayam and testify b'fanei nechta. So the question is, ma ben get lim misa? What's the difference between the case where she brings the get and we rely on her testimony and we allow this woman to get remarried, as opposed to misa, where she testifies that her husband died? And the answer is shaksav mochiach. That in the case where she brings the get, then the get itself is edus. So we're going to rely on the edus in the shtar. So he brought a get from Eretz Yisrael, and we're not afraid of ziyuf. Is therefore, if we're not afraid of ziyuf, then we can rely on the get. But in the case where someone testifies about the death of her husband, we're afraid that he's making up a whole, a fib, the whole thing is one lie, in order to allow himself to marry her. The Mishnah says, Mace, that according to Tanakama, if one witness testifies about the Baal that he died, Haragtiv, I killed him. Haragnu, I was part of a mafia, we killed him as a group. Lo Yisas Ishto. So the Gemara asks, who knew the Lo Yisas Ishto? We're relying on his witness, on his testimony for everybody else, but not for he himself. Liacher tinose. Now imagine a man testifies that I murdered your husband, and now she's allowed to get married. That's against Rav Yosef. Homer Rav Yosef, Ploni Ravani Leonsi. Hu viacher mitztarfin lehargo. But l'rtzoni, Russia, hu vatorah Omer al teishis yotche Russia lios eid chamos. So Rav Yosef says that if a man incriminates himself by saying that I was part of a homosexuality act or I killed somebody in our case, then if he's incriminating himself, then we apply the pasuk al teishis yod chaim Russia. It means he's pasal yedus. So how is it that in our Mishnah the Rotseach is believed to be matir, this woman, L'kuli alma. According to his own confession, he's a murderer and he's a Rasha. And if you'll tell me, maybe in general, the halacha is that if a man incriminates himself, he's not believed, as Rav Yosef postulated. But now we could be more flexible. Why do we have to be more flexible? Because we're talking about a woman and the problem of aguna. And if we don't rely on this witness, then she'll never be able to get married. And that's a kula in the case of Edus Isha. So even though by his own admission he's a Rasha, and according to Rav Yosef, he's incriminating himself, and therefore his Edus is disqualified, but that's not applicable in the case of Edus Isha. So the Gemara rejects this.